Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Dutiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. So, hope that everybody's keeping well wherever it might be. And I've come down here to Welawaya and just had a really nice chance to spend some time in the wilderness and the forest. And recently just came back here today for Patimokkha with the monks, which was really lovely. And so was asked a question actually through YouTube a couple weeks ago about identifying when it's the right time to listen to kind of worries or thoughts of anxiety. I think the word they used was doomsday thoughts, a kind of anxious thoughts of things that could go wrong. And when's the right time to listen to them? When's not the right time to listen to them? So basically in practicing with anxiety is one of the most difficult hindrances to overcome. And it's also one of the most dangerous. So you have these kind of 5 hindrances. I was listening to a talk a few months back, and it was about how, some of them are, not, the Buddha actually says some of them are not that bad, or says some of them are worse than others, and anxiety is the worst, basically. So the problem with dealing with anxiety and fears about the future, worries about what might happen in general, is that there's kind of an element of reasonableness to these thoughts a lot of the time. If somebody is worried about their financial situation, they're worried about their health, they're worried about their job. Actually, all these things are reasonable things to worry about to a certain extent. The problem is when these things tip over and it becomes a situation in which the worries are unreasonable, and the worries actually inhibit a person from doing what's good to do, what's appropriate to do, what's right to do right now, because their mind is too obsessed with worry to function properly. So fear, actually, if in the canon, when people become arahants, it says it's impossible for them to be biased by fear. It doesn't mean that they don't still feel fear. Fear and anxiety being similar sides of the same emotion. So what we're aiming at in practice, for arahants it's permanent, but as we try to move towards arahantship, then one can aim to be less and less biased by the emotion of fear. So what this means is that there's a recognition that fear is a warning. It has a useful component in that it tells us that there's a danger ahead and that we may need to prepare for it. However, one becomes biased by this emotion of fear when one is unable to control the thoughts around the fear, when the thoughts about the fear are inaccurate time and again, but one keeps thinking them. And when these thoughts come up at inappropriate times, basically, when they inhibit one's ability to do good in the present moment, regardless of what the fearful situation is. So the primary faculty that one needs to use in combating this is discernment, basically. Can be. It's the main faculty, the supreme faculty in Buddhism. And it plays an enormous role in determining when the tipping point is between an unreasonable fear and a reasonable caution. So when one has a kind of reasonable caution, then basically one can take that on to a certain extent. Okay, there's this worry that I have about my job. Am I going to, my boss gave me a funny look yesterday. Does it mean that he or she is angry or not? What does it mean? So of course one wants to gather data about these things. And this is how one determines if fears are reasonable or unreasonable. I mean, if one is watching this video, then probably one is an adult. These videos are not for little kids, and it means that one has a kind of idea going back a long time in one's history of things that one has thought about, things that one is worried about. So in this case, one can ask oneself, in the past when I had worries like this, were they reasonable or unreasonable? When in the past when these kind of thoughts came up, did they turn out to be totally false? And then again they've come up, and again I'm worried about them. Usually these kind of anxieties, they're things that are like cartoon villains. They come back like these villains in Batman, or villains in Superman, whatever it might be. The villains come back, they're wearing the same costume, and they get up to the same hijinks. And they're always up to the same things. And you can tell the Joker, he's usually doing something similar. The Penguin, he's usually doing something similar. I don't know what bad guys they have now, but they usually have an agenda. And these thoughts or worries or anxieties about the future can be like this. So they've come up in the past, they've told us something is going to happen, what is it going to be? And it doesn't happen, and they disappear for a little bit, and short time later they're back again saying that almost the same thing will happen. So if these thoughts have shown themselves in this way many, many times before to be false, then we can put them aside. That's one thing. Another thing is that one needs to evaluate the reasonableness of the worries. And for example, World War III, that might happen. Well, it might. We don't know if World War III will happen. But is it reasonable to start building a bunker in my backyard? Well, that's getting a little bit far. So these kind of really big macro issues like global warming, world war, whatever it might be, these humongous issues, actually the people who have an ability to make a significant impact in these issues are the ones who take these issues on a professional level. Professional politicians, the professional, nonprofit people, those people can take that on a professional level, and they'll probably be big players in the game of these macro issues. If one doesn't want to become a professional in these, there may be small things that one can do to contribute. However, beyond those small things, realistically, one will not have an enormous impact on some of these macro issues. If World War III is going to start because of a couple of countries that are not getting along, there's going to be small things that one can do for that, but by and large, unless one wants to take it on as a profession and really put a lot of time and effort into it, one may not have a significant impact. So these worries about these macro issues to a large extent can be put aside. I mean, we do our part one can do their part for, cleaning up the trash in one's neighborhood or recycling or whatever it might be, but that's about what one can do for climate change. Beyond that tipping point, one will become anxious, and some of these times people with these macro issues, they become very angry people. It's kind of very hard to be around them. And that anger is actually more damaging in some cases than whatever potential good they might cause by spreading their message in this very aggressive way. So this is something that one can generally put aside, is worries about these big macro issues. If I'm not going to take it on professionally, I can put it aside. Another thing that one can put aside is if one has an issue or an anxiety or a fear that's coming up and it seems reasonable, and one has put steps in place to try to solve the problem. One has come up with a plan to try to eliminate whatever the dangers are coming from this issue. Or for example, one has a potential financial crunch coming up, then one has decided one's going to budget one's money in a certain way. And that's about all that one can do sometimes, unless one wins the lottery. If there's nothing else that can be done, then actually it's not a worry, because it's not something that one needs to worry about so much, because there's nothing that one can do. One has done what one can do, and one has to let go of the rest. So actually there's one may find actually in times when there's this extreme distress, like sometimes very extreme things are happening in one's life, there's a point where the mind just sometimes lets go of all those things, and actually there's a peace to that. There's a peacefulness to that. Some people may experience this if they feel they just have a moment left to die. It's kind of, there's a point where the mind just lets go, and there's a peacefulness to that. It's kind of all the burdens that one was worrying about have been put down because one feels that there's nothing one can do about them. So there's a peacefulness to letting go of the burdens of these worries that we cannot do anything about. So if one has come up with a plan and one is enacting it, one needs to evaluate that plan to a certain extent. But beyond that, there's nothing one can do. So one can put those worries aside. So we'll talk a little bit about putting the worries aside and how one can do that a little later on in the talk. But the next thing that can be important for these worries is the tone with which one approaches the thinking process around the worry. So if one is worried about one's job, one is worried about, as a monk, sometimes we don't get enough food. We don't know if we're going to get food on Pindapata. We don't know if we're going to have a place to stay or a lodging. It's just, you don't know sometimes. And so these kind of worries, whether one's a lay person, whether one's a monk, whatever it might be, can come up. One of the issues around that is the tone with which one approaches that worry. So if the worry comes up into one's mind and it's like a 5-alarm fire, it's kind of just this scorching, terrible thing, and all these bad things could happen coming from that, and they might, but if that's the tone with which one approaches that worry, it amplifies the worry in one's mind. So one actually wants to try to approach these worries, or actually any feelings that come up in one's mind generally, it's good to have a separation between the feeling and one's mind. It's good to have equanimity. So she was listening to a really nice talk the other day about going through kind of the ups and downs of life and learning to have a sense of equanimity, that when the ups come, then one doesn't become complacent, and when the downs come, one doesn't become despondent or depressed. There's this kind of equanimity to that. So part of this can be helped by the tone with which we approach these worries. I was chatting with somebody the other day about computer, just kind of trying to do something simple on the computer, and like anything that happened on the computer, that any small thing that went wrong was like a 5-alarm fire. It's just, oh my God, this is terrible. It's like anything. It was like a 5-minute or 10-minute thing, but the whole thing was this thing where you just almost feel the anxiety and the worry building up as the minutes went by over this attempt to do something on the computer. So if that's the tone with which one approaches a task, then the task becomes very difficult to do, and it sets the ball of anxiety rolling very, very strongly. So rather than that, for example, if one's trying to do something on the computer and something goes wrong, one wants to have a sense of equanimity towards that. Okay, this went wrong, let's try another way. This went wrong, let's try another way. There's kind of this equanimity towards it. So when this is the case, then one is not setting the cycle of anxiety going in this very strong way through the force with which one attends to anxiety. One wants to attend to these fears in a light way. Not so light that they're not there, but not so strong that one is setting the ball rolling. So one wants to have this appropriate tone of attention to these things, a tone of equanimity, more or less. So another thing that one can do when one has gone through this process of elimination, one has set the feeling tones, is that one wants to have ways to put these thoughts aside. So there was this very famous monk here in Sri Lanka. His name was Dhamma-Vinaya Bhante, and actually he was very inspiring in many ways. He was on his deathbed. He was kind of, well, not his deathbed, but the bed, I think right before he died. He was in the hospital right before he had gone to the monastery where he passed away. And we had this chance to go and pay respects to him. And so I'd had this question in my mind for a long time, because the canon gives antidotes to almost every hindrance, but we don't see an antidote in some of these lists for restlessness and anxiety. So I asked Dhamma-Vinaya Bhante, I was like, what's the antidote to restlessness and anxiety? Because I haven't seen this anywhere in the canon. And he'd stopped speaking almost by that point, not out of weakness necessarily, but because he wanted to preserve his mental energy, I guess, or focus. And he actually was kind enough to answer that question. So he said, it's breath meditation. You can find it in the Udana, and there was another place. So if one is feeling restlessness and anxiety, one of the counters to this is to develop breath meditation. Breath meditation is the way that one cuts off discursive thought And these anxieties run wild based on discursive thought that is not applied in the appropriate proportions. So if one practices breath meditation, develops this as a topic, then one can develop it in such a way that one is just learning to be with the breath and basically nothing else. It's kind of very simple way of doing breath meditation. There's, of course, different ways that can lead up to that. But if one is experiencing a lot of anxiety, it may be helpful to try to make it as simple as possible. Just being the observer, watching the breath go in and out, and being in the present moment. Not letting any thoughts come up, going back to the breath. So this in and of itself can help to short circuit or cut this kind of chain thinking that amps the anxiety up. And it's kind of winds it up until some people, like their body is, can almost shake with anxiety. So having a stable meditation practice is something really, really important. And I was actually chatting to or messaging with a fellow not long ago about dealing with anxiety. We were having a back and forth, and I think he had a good insight. He's kind of he said, well, this particular time we were discussing, he said, well, I think that I'm going to just stick with this meditation routine because it will be a way to combat anxiety. And when one is practicing meditation, one of the first things that happens when anxiety comes up is that one doesn't want to practice meditation because one is face to face with this anxiety. But there's a lot of interesting things that can happen then. Sometimes when one sits down to meditate, the anxiety just dissolves, or whatever it might be just dissolves. And if it doesn't, then it's like hand-to-hand combat with the anxiety, but it's in this way that one learns how to step back from it. It's in this way that one learns how to detach from it. So having a meditation practice is really important because essentially we're learning to tell the mind what to do. We can learn to cut discursive thought, and all of these things are really helpful when we've identified that a thought is unnecessary, that it's leading to anxiety, that we've already made a plan for it, that it's a macro issue that we can't do anything about, and now it's time to put it aside. When we put it aside, we can learn to replace it with something more wholesome, like the breath. So when we practice in this way, learning not to pay attention to anxiety and developing a discernment around what's appropriate to pay attention to and the tone with which it's appropriate to pay attention, then what we can do is direct our minds to whatever possibilities for doing good are here right now. So one of the things that arises with anxiety is that there's this uncertainty to the future. So we base our perceptions of the future on what we can see right now. But the problem is we don't have a complete picture of what's going to happen in the future. Oftentimes these projections into the future can be very inaccurate. So it's good to learn to think of life like planting seeds, a little bit more than making a machine sometimes. In other words, we can plant seeds and it may seem like these bad seeds are growing. But we don't know that. So even if it seems like they're growing, if there's nothing we can do, we plant other seeds in the ground. And the surprising thing is how quickly some of these good seeds that we plant when we're anxious ripen. Sometimes these good seeds can ripen in such a way that it eliminates the need to be anxious about whatever problem A was. You might be worried about your lodging in one place, whether you can get it or not, and things are not going well in one place, so there's nothing you can do, so you keep going to another place and you find a place that's even better. or there's some terrible worry about your job or something like this, and it seems like it's all going to go really, really bad. And if it does go bad, then you may find if you keep planting seeds and moving on, you find an even better job. But this possibility doesn't actually come to be unless we plant those seeds. And anxiety, worry, and fear, that's what can prevent us from actually planting the good seeds in the present moment. So those are a few ways that we can try to learn to train with anxiety, is to first use this discernment to identify when is the worry reasonable or not, to adjust the tone or the force with which we attend to the worry, to have a meditation practice going so that we can learn to cut discursive thought, so we can learn to short circuit the electrical impulses that start this anxiety spinning, and to learn to do good, to plant good seeds in the present moment. Because whenever these ripen, these things can just sometimes totally wipe the anxiety out. So those are a few thoughts on dealing with anxiety, how to know when it's reasonable to attend to it or not, and think that we'll leave that for reflection. And wishing everybody all the blessings of Dhamma practice.